Hey everyone, welcome back to Shop Life. This has been a very requested video, especially with all the swaps that we've done over the years. So today I'm going to be talking about the best BMW engine swap that you can do. This is going to mostly apply to older BMW, so I would say like E46s and older. It could also apply to any other car as far as the fundamentals of the swap. So we're just going to go over the basics first. The best engine swap is actually going to depend on what you actually need. So whatever your driving style is, whatever your goals are with your car, that's what's really going to determine the swap. I'm just going to give a quick overview as far as, what I consider the best swap to be. And I've got pretty good experience. Behind me, we've got 3 of my personal cars and my fiance's car as well with the LS3 swap. They're all E46s, but it pretty much still is a general idea of what you can do as far as swaps for all the older chassis as well. So the first car we've got right here is an E46, the 2001 325i sedan with an LS3 swap. Then the one behind in the middle is my first car actually, which has got an S54 swap. So it's the same thing as an E46 M3, just in a 4-door version. And the last car we've got is our daily, which is the wagon, which they only gave us 325i wagons in the States. So we've got a 330 swap in there. So the first thing when you're considering any swap is you got to figure out what your regulations are wherever you live. So some states, they have emissions and emissions inspections, smog and all of that. So you got to talk, or at least do some research with your DMV to find out what is possible and what isn't. And then if you live in a state or a county where there are no emissions inspections, so like South Carolina, I believe Florida and Texas are the same way, then you can just go crazy and do whatever you want at that point. But that's not to say that in the future they won't put some kind of inspection or emissions restrictions, and at that point you're gonna have to figure out what you're gonna do. So I'm just gonna give the quick gist of it, right? We're gonna start out with the first thing. Whenever you're looking into a swap, you gotta figure out how much you want to spend. Budget is always going to be an important factor in deciding what kind of swap you can do. Whatever you decide as far as your budget, you should be ready to at least add a couple $1,000s on there, because whenever you start a swap, you really don't know what you're going to run into, especially when you're getting an engine from a different car or an engine from somebody that you don't know the actual maintenance history of the engine. You might have to do a lot more stuff to the engine to get it ready to swap. So that's as far as maintenance and all that goes. So that's relative to the engine that you end up getting. So budget wise, it's never going to be enough. Whatever you think you're going to spend, you're always going to end up spending more. So if we're just talking from a budget standpoint, the best swap that you can do is by staying in that same engine family. So for our case right here with the daily wagon, we stayed in the same engine family. It came stock with an M54 B25. We just swapped in an M54 B30. And as far as cost associated with that swap, it was just all the basic maintenance stuff. So all the gaskets, all the hoses, and all of that. And it wasn't really that expensive. The engine we already had from a parts car, so we were just upgrading. And we were able to sell the engine that came in there from factory to somebody else. So the costs pretty much offset of one another, and then all the maintenance stuff we would have had to do anyways on the stock engine. So it worked out for us. And as far as ease of actually doing the swap, it was very easy. I mean, all the wiring is the same, all the mounts, everything. You don't have to do anything custom when you do the same engine family swap. And at that rate, all you really need to do is just some programming. If you have an older car, you might need to just change out the whole ECU or DME. On the E46s, when you do a 330 swap, all you gotta do is just flash the 330 tune on there and you're good to go. And as far as emissions, inspections, and all of that, you will have no problems with that, because when they hook it up, it still shows up as a normal, everything works as it should. We didn't have to modify anything. Everything looks as it should. So that's very emissions friendly swap right there. Now when we're talking about the same engine family, the S54 technically is based kind of off of the M54. It was in the same era. So you can actually do the S54 swap into the E46 without any issues. All the mounts line right up. Everything works as it should, but you do have to do a lot more electronics work. So you do have to change the DME. You have to use the M3 DME. You might have to change some pinouts on some wiring, and that's when stuff starts getting a little expensive. Also, whenever you do the M3 swap, you might have to change other parts of your drivetrain. So you might want to change your rear end for the limited slip. You might want to change the transmission. So there's a lot of stuff that you can play around with when you're doing that kind of a swap. So that brings us to our second option as far as swaps go. If this is going to be a little bit more towards BMWs. So I honestly think the S54 is probably the best engine that you can swap into any E-Series BMWs. Not the E90s, I'm talking about E46s and older. So 3 Series, 5 Series, E28, E34, E46, E39. E39 might be pushing it because it's a little bit heavier of a car, but the S54 is just such a great platform. The biggest thing on the S54 that makes it so swap friendly is you can use all of the factory electronics to make it standalone. So you can use a factory DME, you can use all of the harnesses and all of that and make it standalone as far as deleting the EWS and just making that DME unlocked. And the S54 is a very good platform to add on a lot more power. But that's not to say it's going to be cheap. The S54 is still a pretty expensive engine, especially when you consider all the maintenance stuff, even the purchase price. Most S54s under 200,000 miles, you're going to find for right around 3,000 and higher. And once you start doing all the maintenance, so like rod bearings, bulletproofing the vanos, all that stuff is just going to start adding up. So for me, for my personal S54 swap, we were in it right around $13,000 in parts. But we also did the whole drivetrain and we bought a whole E46 M3 donor car. But if you look at the S54, people have swapped S54s into everything. E30s, E36s, E28s, and a lot of people also turbocharge the S54 once they have it bulletproofed. So that's one thing that we're not considering is the cost associated with that swap. We're just talking about as far as how it is compatible with all these other cars. And since it's been done so many times before, there's a lot of information out there as to how to do it, what kind of wiring you may need to do. All that information is available for the BMWs. So I would say the S54 is probably one of the best swaps to do if you're doing something at home. That doesn't require too much customization. It's very straightforward and it's very well documented. Now, if you're just chasing big power and you're not worried about compatibility with the rest of the car, so like with S54, all of the modules can still talk to each other whenever you do it into an E46, and you still get a good bump in power. But if you're just looking for like a strict drag car or performance car, I honestly think the best bang for your buck is an LS swap. Main reason I say that is because for an LS swap, you can get big power for little money. And LS engines, there's so many of them to choose from. You can get a 5.3, a 6.0, 6.2. You can even do something with the 4.8 and turbocharge those. There's so many options out there. But now that's where it comes to the downfalls with the LS swap. Whenever you're doing an LS swap, there's a lot of customization you have to do. And sometimes all the modules may not communicate with each other, so you might have other issues come up in the future. If you're going to be considering an LS swap, I would probably go with it for more of a track car. I wouldn't really suggest it for a daily car unless you're willing to work out all of the kinks, and that might take a while. So as you can see with our LS swap, we're still doing a lot of development on it as far as mounts, as far as wiring, trying to make it more plug-and-play friendly. Eventually we might even come out with the kit for the LS swap so you can swap it into your own BMW. And that's the main reason why our LS swap still looks unfinished, is because we're always changing things up, whether it be changing up the harness so we can connect it directly to the BMW side of things, make all the modules work, make traction control work, AC, all of that stuff, and as far as mounts and stuff. So our LS swap goal was not to be a track car. It was supposed to be a daily car where we can actually have everything working properly as it would if it was an S54 or just a bigger engine swap from the BMW series. Now, it comes to newer generations. The E46 is getting outdated pretty quickly. It's still not at that level of a classic such as the E30, so there's not really that much demand for swaps in the E46s just yet. But like I said, E30s, there's LS swap kits out there for the E30 as well. The E30 is a little bit more analog, so whenever you do an LS swap in there, you don't really have to worry about as much about the modules and stuff, but you still have to worry about fabricating quite a few things to make sure everything is working the way you want it. And you also have to do a lot more drivetrain upgrades, so you have to do more stuff to the rear end for the differential, drive shaft, all that stuff needs to be customized. And that's when all these costs start skyrocketing. So for example, the LS swap, we did go about with the more expensive route. We bought a whole donor car, we bought a bunch of new stuff that we could have made work with the used stuff. We did a lot more custom work, and we did a lot more trying things out, trying to figure it out instead of going out with the swap kit. So that's why our costs were substantially more than what you might incur. But whenever you start considering labor, anytime you're doing a swap, if you're paying somebody else to do it, it's definitely not going to be, feasible as far as trying to recoup your money if you were to sell the car. And main reason that is because labor costs, whenever you do any kind of swap, is going to be determined based on what you're swapping and how much customization goes, how much maintenance, all that stuff factors in. So now moving on to the newer cars that have been coming out, so E90s and newer. There's a lot of good engines that BMW is currently developing or already has in production. One of my favorites would be the N54. Another one would be the B58. The S55, S58, they're all variations of these N-series engines, but they all have a good amount of power, and mainly because they are turbocharged. So whenever you start looking at these newer engines, those swaps are going to be a lot more expensive still if you're going backwards into a different chassis. So let's say doing an N54 swap into an E46, or doing a B58 or S55 swap into an older E46 and older. The main reason those costs are going to be more expensive is because there aren't really too many standalone kits for those. So if you want everything to work, it's going to be a lot harder. You're going to have to actually take a lot of the modules out of those newer cars and figure out a way for them to communicate with the older modules. But now if you're doing, let's say, a B58 swap into an E90, it's the same thing. A lot of those modules have been upgraded, so you have to figure out a way to make everything communicate, or you might just want to do it as far as making it like a track car. And in that case, you don't really have to worry about all the modules communicating, and you can just swap it in there. But even then, you still have to figure out how some of those modules are going to communicate, or you have to go completely with a separate controller, so a separate standalone system. And those standalone systems usually start right around $3,000 to $4,000. So right off the bat, you're already down $3,000 just for the computer side of things. So that's when all these newer cars, these swaps are going to be a lot more difficult to do until there's more development on those, until more people are trying to figure out how to unlock the factory DMEs to get rid of EWS, the CAS system. There's so many things that go into a swap when you're considering all these newer cars. So like I said, newer cars, more modules. When you go with older engines and older cars and swapping them backwards, like into, let's say, like the S54 into an E30, it's a little bit more simpler because the S54 you can make it standalone, and the E30 doesn't have that many modules that it has to communicate together anyways. So moral of the story, a quick rundown of what my recommendations are. If you're doing something in your garage, let's say this is your first engine swap and you want to have that extra power, and you're like, let's say you're doing it into an E36. You want the extra power and you want to, modernize everything, make it really quick, have a good starting point, and you're not too worried about the cost associated, I would definitely go with an S54. That's going to be very easy to figure out how to mount. It's been very well documented. You can find all kinds of information on how to do it. So S54, perfect right at home in the E36, E30, E28, all of those cars. Now let's say you're building a drag car, or you want to do only a track car, a drift car, anything like that, where you're not worried about emissions, you're not worried about anything like custom harshness, you're not worried about anything like that. LS swap is the way to go. You can buy an LS from the junkyard. There's so many out there. You can turbo them. There's so many cheap turbo kits for those. And if you're doing everything at home and you have the ability to customize stuff, the LS swap is the way to go. You might even be right on par as far as pricing as the S54 swap, but you might be double the power. So that's definitely an option if you are that advanced. Now, if this is your first engine swap or even just engine replacement of any kind, and you just want to go a little bit more power, that's when you might want to consider the same chassis, whatever the most powerful engine available in that same chassis, and swap it in. So for example, with our wagon, we got the 330 engine and swapped it into the 325i wagon. And that's the easiest way to do it, and there's all kinds of documentation available for that as well. So I hope this video kind of cleared things up as far as what swaps I recommend. There's so many options out there. There's so many crazy swaps that people do. But at the end of the day, it all comes down to how you want your car to behave, how you want it to feel, and what your end goals are, and also how much money you want to spend. So I hope this helps you guys out. If you guys have any questions as far as any swaps or anything like that, feel free to leave a comment down below. I'm sure a lot of my audience has experienced some kind of swap or seen something. And if you have any ideas of a swap that you haven't seen done, but you would want us to do in the future, leave a comment down below. We'll see if there's something that really catches our attention. We might take it on, you never know. Thank you guys for watching. We'll see you guys in our next video. Oh, and by the way, if you guys want me to go more in depth on a specific swap, like the S54 into an E30, or S54 into an E36, or S54 into an E46, comment down below which swap you want me to go in depth with, as far as just giving you an overview of what you should be looking into.